Story number 1. The invitation to the final journey. The night was cold, biting through the cracks in the window frame of my small bedroom. Snow blanketed the streets outside, muffling the world in an eerie silence. It was Christmas Eve, and like every year since Dad passed away, I found myself alone with my thoughts. But this Christmas was different. It started with the ticket, a small, golden slip of paper that appeared on my desk without explanation. Embossed on it were the words, "The final journey. Admit one. Departure at midnight." At first, I thought it was a joke. Maybe one of the kids from school had slipped it through the window as a prank. But when I turned it over, I saw my name etched into the back in elegant cursive, Tom Harris. A shiver crawled up my spine. Midnight came faster than I expected. The house was deathly quiet, save for the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock in the living room. I sat on my bed, staring at the ticket, debating whether to ignore it or follow it. That's when I heard it. The low, haunting whistle of a train echoed from somewhere outside. But there were no tracks near my house, not for miles. Yet when I peered out my window, there it was, a massive black locomotive, its engine hissing steam into the icy air. It sat idle in the middle of the street, as if waiting for me, compelled by an inexplicable force. I grabbed my coat and the golden ticket, then stepped out into the snow. The train loomed larger as I approached, its windows glowing with an unsettling yellow light. The conductor, a tall man in a long coat and a hat that obscured his face, stood at the open door. "Mr. Harris," he said in a voice that sounded more like a growl than words. "We've been expecting you." I hesitated, clutching the ticket tightly in my hand. Something about his presence felt wrong. But before I could turn back, he extended a gloved hand and helped me onto the train. The interior was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Plush red velvet seats lined the walls, and golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow that didn't quite reach the corners. It felt luxurious, yet cold, lifeless. Even the passengers were stranger still. Each of them was dressed in clothing from a different era. A woman in a Victorian gown, a soldier in a World War II uniform, a man in a three-piece suit from the 1920s. They sat silently, staring out the windows or at their folded hands. None of them acknowledged me. I chose a seat near the back, hoping to avoid drawing attention. The train jolted forward, and the world outside blurred into a swirling mist. After what felt like hours, I worked up the courage to speak to the woman sitting across from me. Her gown was tattered, the fabric stained with something dark. "Excuse me," I whispered. "Where is this train going?" She turned to me slowly, her face pale and gaunt, as if she hadn't eaten in years. Her eyes, sunken and lifeless, met mine. "To the end," she said simply. I sank back into my seat, my heart racing. The end? What did that mean? I clutched the ticket in my pocket, its edges now damp from the sweat on my palms. As the train sped onward, the mist outside began to part, revealing a vast, desolate landscape. Trees with gnarled branches reached out like skeletal hands, and the ground was littered with broken gravestones. The passengers began to stir, their murmurs growing louder. "The final stop," someone whispered. The conductor appeared again, moving down the aisle. "Prepare yourselves," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. When the train came to a halt, I peered out the window and saw a massive iron gate with the words, J. Thien, then arched above it. Beyond the gate was a city bathed in an unearthly light, its buildings impossibly tall and twisted, reaching toward a sky that pulsed like a living thing. One by one, the passengers filed off the train. Some looked relieved, others terrified. When it was my turn to step onto the platform, I felt a hand grip my shoulder. "You don't belong here," a voice hissed. I turned to see an elderly man in a bowler hat, his face etched with lines of sorrow. "This train isn't for the living," he said. "Leave while you can." Panic surged through me. I clutched the ticket tighter and backed away from the gate. The conductor watched me from the steps of the train, his face obscured by shadows. "You have a choice," he said, his tone almost mocking. I ran. I don't know how I made it back onto the train, but I did. The moment I sat down, the train lurched forward again, the gate disappearing into the mist. The passengers who remained stared at me with blank, hollow eyes. When the train finally stopped, I found myself back where I had started, in the middle of my snowy street. The locomotive hissed one last time before vanishing into the darkness. I stumbled back into my house, my mind racing. It had to be a dream, I told myself. Just a vivid, terrible dream. But when I reached into my pocket, I pulled out the golden ticket. It was real, its edges worn and frayed. And on the back, the elegant cursive had changed. It now read, "You've been warned." I never saw the train again, but every Christmas Eve, I hear its whistle in the distance, a chilling reminder of the journey I almost couldn't return from. Story number 2. The train home. It was Christmas Eve, and the air in the train station was bitterly cold. I had just finished the last shift of my year-end workload, and my only thought was getting back to the small town where I grew up. The train I boarded was nearly empty. The few passengers huddled in their seats with scarves wrapped tightly around their faces. I found a spot by the window, sank into the hard bench seat, and let the rhythmic clatter of the wheels lull me into sleep. When I woke up, the train was eerily quiet. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It was bone deep, far sharper than when I had boarded. The air seemed heavier, as though it carried something more than just frost. I glanced around the car, where once there had been passengers. Now there were only empty seats. Even the conductor was gone, his post abandoned. Outside the window, the landscape was blurred and dreamlike. The snow-covered fields and sparse trees I remembered from past trips were replaced by a shifting haze of shadow and light. There were no signs of civilization, no farmhouses or distant lights, just an endless expanse of nothingness. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer. My voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The train slowed. The grinding brakes screamed into the void. And then, with a shudder, it stopped. Through the frost-covered window, I could make out a faint shape in the darkness. A platform? My heart pounded as I grabbed my coat and stepped into the aisle. The moment I opened the door to the next car, a gust of icy air hit me like a slap. I stepped out onto the platform, my boots crunching against the frost-covered boards. I knew this place. My mind scrambled to understand what I was seeing, but it made no sense. The platform was one I hadn't seen in decades. Wooden, old-fashioned, with a lamppost casting a dim yellow light that flickered in the wind. And beyond it, there was my hometown, but not as I remembered it. This wasn't the bustling, modernized town I had visited year after year. This was something much older. The houses were smaller, the streets unpaved, and the windows glowed with the warm light of oil lamps. I stumbled forward, drawn by a strange, irresistible pull. When I reached the main street, everything felt achingly familiar yet completely alien. Snow dusted the rooftops, and garlands of evergreen hung across the street. The smell of roasted chestnuts wafted from a vendor's cart, and children played in the snow, their laughter ringing through the air. My breath hitched when I saw the town square. It was exactly as it had been when I was a boy, decades ago. But this was impossible. My town hadn't looked like this since the early 1930s. I followed the pull in my chest, my boots crunching over the snow-packed road. Every step felt surreal, as though I was walking through a dream. And then, I saw her. Standing in the doorway of the house where I had grown up was my mother. She looked exactly as she had during the Christmas of 1930, the last one we had together before she died in a house fire. She was younger, her hair pinned neatly back, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "Jack!" she called out, her voice as clear and real as the wind biting at my skin. She smiled the same smile I had seen in photographs, the one I had dreamed of seeing again for decades. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, torn between joy and an overwhelming sense of wrongness. "Come in, dear. Dinner's ready," she said, waving me forward. I climbed the steps, my hands trembling. Inside, the house was just as I remembered it. The scent of pine from the Christmas tree filled the air, mingling with the smell of roasted turkey. Everything was perfect, down to the worn rug in the living room and the old radio playing Christmas carols in the corner. "Sit down, Jack," my mother said, placing a steaming plate of food in front of me. "You must be starving." I Saturday, but something was gnawing at the edges of my mind. This wasn't real. Couldn't be. I looked around the table and saw my father and my sister, both of whom had passed away years ago. They were laughing, eating, their voices so natural that it almost convinced me I was imagining things. "Eat, Jack," my father said, his voice stern but kind. "You're home now." But I wasn't home. This was something else. I pushed my chair back and stood. "I can't stay," I said, my voice shaking. My mother's smile faltered. "But it's Christmas, Jack. You've come all this way. Don't leave." Her voice sounded distant now, hollow. The warmth of the room felt suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight. I turned toward the door, but my feet felt like they were sinking into the floor. When I looked down, I saw that the hardwood had turned into slush, dark and cold, creeping up my legs. "Stay with us, Jack," my sister whispered, her eyes no longer warm but glassy and black. I don't know how I managed to break free. I stumbled out the door and back onto the platform, the sound of their voices following me, growing louder and more desperate. The train was still there, its engine hissing softly. I climbed aboard and slammed the door shut behind me. As the train pulled away, I looked back. The town was gone. There was only darkness, the faint outline of snow-covered fields stretching into the void. When I arrived at my destination, the station master looked at me with confusion. "This train hasn't run for years," he said. "They retired it after a derailment back in 1930. I didn't respond. I simply walked out into the cold December air, clutching the ticket that was still in my pocket. The date printed on it read, December 24th, 1930. Story number 3. The ghost train's bell. It was the night before Christmas, and the snow had blanketed the small town of Briarwood in silence. Most folks were indoors, gathered around fireplaces or trimming their Christmas trees. But I had volunteered for the late-night shift at the Briarwood Depot. It wasn't a busy station anymore. Most trains had been replaced by highways and trucks, but the depot still operated for the occasional freight line passing through. I liked the quiet, the sound of the wind rattling the old glass panes, the distant hoots of owls. It was comforting in a way. But that night, there was something else, something I couldn't explain. The first sound came around 11:45 p.m. I was sitting at the dispatcher's desk, nursing a cup of coffee gone lukewarm. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint, rhythmic clinking, like metal tapping against metal. But as it grew louder, my heart sank. It was unmistakably the sound of a bell, the kind you'd find on an old steam locomotive. I glanced at the schedule pinned to the corkboard. There were no trains due that night. The sound drew closer, resonating through the empty depot. The bell's rhythm was slow, deliberate, almost mournful. I stepped out onto the platform, pulling my coat tight against the biting wind. The snow glistened under the dim station lights, and the tracks stretched into the darkness like twin ribbons of steel. Then, from the far end of the line, I saw it, a flicker of orange light, faint but growing brighter. It didn't look like a modern train. It was something older, a relic from another era. The bell clanged louder now, echoing in the icy night. The train emerged from the shadows, its massive black engine engulfed in a faint, unnatural glow. Flames flickered along its sides, yet it didn't seem to burn. Behind the engine, a line of coal cars rattled noiselessly, their frames warped and charred. As it approached the platform, the train slowed, and I caught a glimpse of the faces. They were passengers. Or at least they looked like passengers. Pale, translucent faces stared out from behind the soot-streaked windows. Their eyes were hollow, and their mouths moved silently, as if crying out for help. But no sound came. I froze, unable to look away as the train crawled to a stop. The bell ceased its tolling, leaving only the sound of the wind whipping through the depot. And then, the conductor stepped out. He was tall and thin, his uniform scorched and tattered. His face was obscured by shadows, but his eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. He didn't speak. Instead, he raised a gloved hand and pointed directly at me. "Bored," a voice whispered, though his lips never moved. I shook my head, stumbling backward. "I'm not going anywhere," I stammered. The conductor tilted his head, almost curiously, before stepping back onto the train. The bell resumed its haunting toll, and the engine let out a hiss of steam. The train began to move, slowly at first, then faster, vanishing into the snowy darkness as quickly as it had appeared. When I returned to the depot, I locked every door and window. My hands were trembling as I picked up the phone to call the station master. But my words caught in my throat. On the dispatcher's desk, where I'd left my coffee, lay a pile of soot. In the center of it was a tarnished silver ticket stamped with a date. December 24th, 1892. That date stirred something in my memory. I rummaged through the dusty filing cabinet in the back office until I found it. A yellowed newspaper clipping from decades ago. The headline read, "Coal Train Disaster Claims 23 Lives on Christmas Eve." The article described how a freight train carrying coal had caught fire near Briarwood Depot. The flames spread quickly, trapping the passengers on board. By the time help arrived, the train was nothing more than a smoldering skeleton. For weeks after that night, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces in the windows, their mouths silently pleading. I couldn't shake the feeling that the train would return, and that next time, it might not leave without a passenger. The following year, I left Briarwood and moved to the city. I told myself I was chasing better opportunities, but the truth was, I couldn't stay near those tracks. Even now, decades later, I still avoid train stations, but every Christmas Eve, without fail, I hear it, the faint toll of a bell in the distance, growing louder with each passing minute. And sometimes, if the night is especially quiet, I swear I can hear the whisper, "Bored." Story number 4. The passenger. I'd worked the Christmas Eve shift on the night train for nearly 10 years. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it had its perks: quiet cars, no rush of morning commuters, and, of course, the occasional tips from grateful passengers traveling to see family. But that Christmas Eve, in 1989, something happened that still haunts me to this day. It was the night I met him, the man with the old suitcase. The train was unusually empty that night. Most people had already reached their destinations or decided to stay home to avoid the storm that had rolled in. I was assigned to the last car, and as we pulled out of the station, I settled into my usual routine, checking tickets and tidying up stray newspapers left behind. I first noticed him as we approached the outskirts of town. He boarded at a small, nearly abandoned station, a man in his late 60s, dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit. He carried an old leather suitcase that looked like it had seen better days. It was the kind of luggage you'd expect to see in a black and white photograph, not in the late 80s. "Good evening," I said, offering a smile as I approached him. He didn't respond. Instead, he handed me his ticket without a word and took a seat by the window. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as if he were a character in an old film reel. I glanced at the ticket. It was dated for that night, but the handwriting looked strange, too ornate, like calligraphy from a bygone era. I chalked it up to his old-fashioned demeanor and continued down the aisle. But something about him unsettled me. The train moved steadily through the snow-covered countryside, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels filling the silence. Occasionally, I glanced back at the man, He never moved, never took his eyes off the darkened window. The suitcase sat on the floor beside him, its brass clasps glinting faintly under the dim overhead lights. Around midnight, I decided to make another pass through the car. As I approached, I noticed something strange. Frost had formed on the inside of the window where he was sitting. It was the only window like that in the entire car. "Is everything all right, sir?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the empty car. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned his head slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting mine for the first time. They were icy, void of warmth or life. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Would you like anything from the dining car?" I tried again, my voice wavering. "No," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Then he turned back to the window, as if I no longer existed. The storm outside intensified, snow slamming against the windows in thick sheets. I retreated to the front of the car, eager to put some distance between myself and the man. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, even though his back was to me. When we reached the final station, I waited for him to disembark. The other passengers had already left, and the train was eerily silent. But when I walked to the back of the car, his seat was empty. The man was gone. I looked around, confused. The doors were still closed, and there was no way he could have slipped past me. But then I noticed the suitcase, still sitting on the floor where he'd left it. I hesitated, unsure whether I should open it. Something about it felt wrong, as if the suitcase itself carried a weight far greater than its size. But my curiosity got the better of me. With trembling hands, I knelt and flipped open the brass clasps. Inside were photographs, dozens, maybe hundreds of them. They were old, black and white snapshots of people sitting on trains, standing on platforms, smiling with loved ones. But as I flipped through them, I noticed a chilling pattern. Every single person in the photographs was staring directly at the camera, their expressions eerily blank. And the backgrounds, they were all the same window, the same frost, the same seat where the man had been sitting. I felt the blood drain from my face as I recognized one of the faces. It was a woman I had seen on the train months earlier, a regular passenger who had vanished without a trace. Another photograph showed a young man who had been reported missing the year before. And then, at the very back of the stack, I saw something that made me drop the suitcase. It was a picture of me. I stumbled back, my breath hitching as the photographs spilled onto the floor. The train creaked and groaned around me, as if it were alive, and the temperature in the car plummeted. The frost on the window began to spread, creeping toward me like a living thing. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "Thank you for the ride," it whispered, echoing through the car. I bolted. I ran through the cars, my footsteps echoing wildly as I made my way to the conductor's cabin. When I told him what had happened, he looked at me like I was crazy. But when we returned to the last car, the suitcase was gone. The frost was gone. The photographs were gone. It was as if none of it had ever happened. I quit my job a week later. I couldn't stay, not after what I'd seen. But the memory of that night still haunts me. Every Christmas Eve, I find myself looking out my window, half expecting to see a man in a dark suit, standing in the snow with his old suitcase. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear the sound of a train whistle in the distance, followed by a faint whisper, "Tickets, please." Story number 5. The Cursed Steam Train. I first heard about the cursed steam train when I was a boy, sitting on the worn leather couch in my grandfather's dimly lit living room. He would talk about it in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might summon it. To him, it wasn't just a story, it was a warning. And like most warnings from our elders, I didn't take it seriously, at least, not until I saw it with my own eyes. The story was simple yet chilling. In 1899, a steam train carrying cargo derailed during a fierce blizzard and plunged into the icy ravine known as Dead Man's Gorge. Every soul on board, engineers, brakemen, and a few stowaways was lost. Their bodies were never recovered, buried under tons of snow and shattered steel. But the legend didn't end with the crash. According to locals, every Christmas Eve, the train would return, its whistle piercing the still night air. It didn't stop at any station. It merely passed through, its glowing headlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of a predator. Those who saw it would hear the mournful wails of the doomed passengers and, worse, would feel its icy grip long after the train disappeared. I never believed it, not really, but one snowy Christmas Eve, I found myself in a position where disbelief would no longer protect me. It was a quiet night at the station where I worked as a junior conductor. I'd volunteered to take the shift, partly to avoid the chaos of my family's Christmas gathering and partly because I liked the solitude. The old station, with its creaking floors and soot-streaked walls, had a charm that was almost comforting until the storm rolled in. The snow came fast and heavy, blanketing the tracks and muffling every sound except the occasional howl of the wind. I was sitting in the office, staring out the frosted window, when I heard it, the faint but unmistakable sound of a train whistle. It didn't make sense. There were no scheduled trains that night, and the tracks leading out of the station had been deemed impassable hours ago. But the whistle grew louder, closer, until the walls of the office seemed to vibrate with its eerie resonance. I stepped outside, my boots crunching on the freshly fallen snow. The platform was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the station's flickering lights. Then I saw it. The train emerged from the storm like a phantom, its headlights glowing with a strange, otherworldly intensity. The engine was massive, its blackened steel shimmering in the snow, and behind it trailed a line of freight cars that seemed impossibly long. The entire train glided silently over the tracks, the sound of its whistle reverberating in my chest like a heartbeat. I stood frozen, watching as it passed. Through the frost-covered windows of the engine car, I could make out shadowy figures moving inside, engineers, perhaps, though their shapes were distorted and wrong. The freight cars were worse. Each one seemed to hold something different. Crates that rattled as if something inside was trying to escape, empty cages, and, in one car, rows of chairs filled with passengers who sat unnaturally still. As the last car rolled past, I noticed the figure standing on the rear platform, a man, or at least something that resembled one, dressed in a conductor's uniform that looked older than the station itself. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes locked onto mine. He raised his hand, and I swear I felt the icy grip of his fingers even though he was yards away. He gestured for me to follow, to step closer, and for a moment, I almost did. The train disappeared into the blizzard as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind nothing but silence. My hands were trembling as I stumbled back into the station, locking the door behind me, but the sense of cold didn't leave. It seeped into my bones, lingering like a shadow that refused to fade. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man on the platform, his outstretched hand beckoning me into the storm. And then there were the dreams, if you could call them that. In each one, I was aboard the train, walking through its endless cars. The passengers turned to watch me, their faces blank and their eyes hollow. The conductor was always there, waiting at the end of the train, his smile sharp as broken glass. Over the years, I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the storm and my overactive imagination. But then I met others, people from towns up and down the old rail line who had their own stories about the cursed train. Some had heard its whistle. Others had seen its headlights cutting through the snow. A few had seen the conductor, just as I had, and bore the same haunted look I saw in the mirror every Christmas Eve. The most chilling account came from an old man in a nearby town. He claimed his father had boarded the train one fateful Christmas Eve, lured by the promise of warmth and shelter. The next morning, they found his father's boots in the snow beside the tracks. But nothing else. The train had taken him, the old man said, and he had never come back. I still work at the station, though I never take the Christmas Eve shift anymore. Someone else can deal with the storms and the silence and whatever waits out there on the tracks. But every year, as the clock nears midnight, I hear it, the whistle, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the snowy night, and I know it's out there, gliding along the rails, carrying its cargo of lost souls towards some unknown destination. I wonder if it remembers me, if it's waiting for me to step onto the platform once more. Sometimes, I think about what might happen if I did, but then I hear the conductor's voice in my dreams, whispering softly, "Tickets, please." Story number 6. The 13th Stop. I first heard the legend when I was a kid, huddled around a crackling fire with my cousins on a bitterly cold Christmas Eve. It was one of those tales whispered in the dark, meant to scare you just enough to make you look over your shoulder on the walk home. But as I grew older, the story lingered in the back of my mind, refusing to fade like most childhood fears. The tale of the 13th Stop was simple. If you boarded a train at midnight on Christmas Eve, the train would make an unscheduled stop at a station not found on any map. The 13th station. Those who stepped off would never return. They were said to be drawn into a strange, eternal world where the echoes of Christmas cheer became a sinister prison. It sounded like nonsense, but some stories have a way of pulling at you, of daring you to prove them wrong. That's how I found myself standing on a freezing platform late on Christmas Eve, holding hands with my girlfriend, Claire. "This is crazy," she whispered, her breath forming soft clouds in the icy air. "You know that, right?" "Of course it's crazy," I said, squeezing her hand. "That's why we're doing it." She gave me a half-smile, the kind that meant she thought I was an idiot but loved me anyway. The train arrived exactly on time, its whistle piercing the silent night. It looked like any other train, with its gleaming steel cars and frost-covered windows. We boarded and found an empty compartment near the back. There were a few other passengers, but no one looked at us or spoke. The air inside was heavy, like the silence before a storm. The train pulled away from the station, and for a while, everything felt normal. We passed snow-covered fields and darkened towns, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels lulling us into a strange sense of calm. Claire rested her head on my shoulder, and I found myself staring out the window, watching the world blur by. That's when the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, a brief dimming that could have been a power glitch. But then it happened again, and this time the lights didn't fully return. The compartment was bathed in a pale, sickly glow that made the shadows seem deeper and more alive. The train began to slow, and Claire sat up. "Is this it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though I wasn't sure. I'd never heard of any stops between our departure point and the next station. But the train was definitely coming to a halt. Outside the window, a faint light appeared, growing brighter as the train screeched to a stop. We stepped off the train, our boots crunching on the snow-dusted platform. The air was colder here, almost unnaturally so, and the silence was deafening. The platform was old, its wooden boards warped and splintered, and a sign hung overhead, its letters barely legible. Station 13. First, seemed like we were alone. The train pulled away behind us, its whistle echoing into the void, leaving us stranded. Then, faintly, we heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Music. It was the kind of music you'd hear at a Christmas party, cheerful and lively, but there was something off about it. The notes were too sharp, too dissonant, as if they were being played by someone who had forgotten what joy sounded like. "Where is that coming from?" Claire asked, clutching my arm. I pointed toward a faint glow in the distance. A large building loomed at the edge of the platform, its windows glowing with warm, inviting light. The music grew louder as we approached, and I could hear laughter, soft, almost melodic, but with an edge that made my skin crawl. Inside, the building was a grand hall, decorated with garlands and wreaths that seemed untouched by time. A massive Christmas tree stood in the center, its ornaments shimmering in the flickering candlelight. Around it, People danced and laughed, their faces blurred like smudges on an old photograph. Claire tugged at my sleeve. "We should leave," she whispered, but I was drawn in. The scene was hypnotic, almost beautiful in its strangeness. One of the dancers turned toward us, a woman in a flowing red dress. Her face came into focus, and I felt my stomach drop. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to see right through me. The music stopped abruptly, and every head in the room turned toward us. Their faces were twisted, grinning in a way that felt more like a threat than a welcome. The woman in red stepped forward, her movements fluid and unnatural, like a marionette on invisible strings. "Welcome to the party," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "You're just in time." Claire grabbed my hand, and we turned to run, but the door we had entered was gone. The hall stretched endlessly in every direction, filled with the sound of shuffling feet and whispered laughter. The dancers closed in, their hands outstretched, their empty eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. I don't know how we escaped. My memories of that night are a blur of panic and cold and the relentless sound of footsteps chasing us through the endless halls. When we finally stumbled back onto the platform, the train was waiting, its doors open as if it had been expecting us. We boarded without hesitation, collapsing into our seats as the train pulled away. Neither of us spoke until we saw the familiar lights of our home station. When we stepped off the train, the platform was deserted, and the snow had covered any trace of our departure. We never spoke of Station 13 again, but every Christmas Eve, I hear it, the faint sound of music, drifting through the cold night air. I don't look for it. I don't dare, because I know that if I listen too closely, I might hear the whistle of a train, calling me back to a place I can never leave. Story number 7. The Ghost Train of Christmas Eve. They still talk about it in the village, a hushed legend passed down through generations. It's always the same, a train, departing from our small, snow-covered station on Christmas Eve in 1943, bound for the next town over. A journey that should have been routine, but instead became a chilling mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Growing up, I thought it was just a story parents told their children to keep them from wandering near the train tracks at night. But as I got older, the details became harder to dismiss. There were too many witnesses, too many unanswered questions. And now, as I write this, I can't shake the feeling that the train story is still incomplete. This is what I know. Christmas Eve, 1943, was a bitterly cold night. Snow had fallen steadily for hours, blanketing the village in silence. The 11:15 p.m. train was scheduled to depart from our station, a modest locomotive with 3 passenger cars and a skeleton crew. It wasn't unusual for the train to be sparsely populated. Most people stayed home with their families that night, celebrating the season, but a handful of passengers always boarded, traveling to the next town for their own reasons, work, family, or something more private. The station master, Henry Grayson, was the last person known to have seen the train and its passengers. He described a quiet scene as the train pulled away, a few scattered passengers settling into their seats, the conductor making his rounds, and the engineer giving a friendly wave from the cab. The train chugged into the darkness, its headlamp cutting through the falling snow. It never arrived at the next station. At first, no one thought much of it. Delays were common in winter, especially with the snowstorm intensifying. But by morning, concern had turned to alarm. The train, its crew, and its passengers had vanished. Search parties scoured the tracks, combing every inch between the 2 stations. But there was no sign of a derailment or any wreckage. The snow remained undisturbed, as if the train had never passed through. The next day, rumors began to spread. Some claimed they had seen strange lights along the tracks that night, pulsing orbs of pale blue that hovered in the air before fading away. Others spoke of hearing faint, ghostly voices carried on the wind, though no one could agree on what they were saying. Then came the discovery. 3 days after the train's disappearance, a railway worker found it sitting idle on a remote siding, miles from its intended route. The engine was cold, its fires long extinguished. Every car was empty, eerily pristine, as though no one had ever boarded. The villagers flocked to see it, their breath fogging in the freezing air as they peered through the frosted windows. The train had an unnatural stillness about it, a heavy quiet that seemed to press down on anyone who approached. Those brave enough to step inside described feeling a suffocating chill, even colder than the winter air outside. But the most unsettling detail was found in the rear car, a single suitcase, left open on one of the seats. Inside was a set of neatly folded clothes and nothing else. The train was eventually towed back to the station, where investigators tried to make sense of what had happened. They found no signs of foul play, no clues to the whereabouts of the crew or passengers. The only anomaly was the train's condition. Despite sitting out in the snowstorm for days, the tracks leading to the siding showed no evidence of its journey. It was as if the train had appeared out of thin air. Officially, the case was closed as unsolved. Unofficially, the story took on a life of its own. Some said the train had entered another dimension, a tear in reality that had swallowed its passengers whole. Others believed it had become a vessel for lost souls, ferrying them to the afterlife. A few whispered that the passengers had been taken, by what or whom. They dared not speculate. As the years passed, the story faded into folklore. The train was sold for scrap, and the siding was dismantled. But the legend never truly died. Every Christmas Eve, without fail, someone claims to see lights along the tracks, or to hear the faint whistle of a train in the distance. And once, just once, a man swore he saw the train itself, a shadowy outline gliding silently through the snow, its windows aglow with a ghostly light. I've always been skeptical of such tales, but last year, on Christmas Eve, something happened that made me question everything. I was walking home from the station after visiting an old friend. The night was quiet, the snow falling in thick, lazy flakes. As I approached the bend in the tracks, the spot where the train had been found all those years ago, I saw it, a faint blue light, flickering through the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The light grew brighter, pulsing steadily, until I could make out its source. It was the train not as a ghostly vision, but solid and real, its cars gleaming in the moonlight. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. Through the windows, I saw shadowy figures seated inside, their faces indistinct but unmistakably human. They didn't move, didn't speak. They simply sat there staring straight ahead. And then the whistle blew, a mournful, echoing sound that sent shivers down my spine. The train began to move, gliding away into the darkness. Within moments, it was gone, leaving no trace behind. I haven't spoken of what I saw until now, but as another Christmas approaches, I feel compelled to share this story. The train may have vanished from the tracks, but it hasn't left us. It's out there, waiting for what? I don't know. But if you ever hear the whistle on Christmas Eve, don't follow it. Don't look for the train, because if you find it, you may never come back.